All right, welcome everyone. This is our lecture on the prophets, and we're going to talk about some important themes regarding their theology, royal theology, issues on justice, and also overall how they viewed God as a creator of the world. As I briefly mentioned, when we're looking at the prophets overall, we know that we have our prophetic books. These are the 16 books that we have within the Old Testament. Now, these prophetic books, they were written between the end of the nation of Israel. So you had the fall of Israel, and then much later you had the fall of Judah, and then you had the Babylonian exile. So you have these two different periods between it's around the around between the 430s and the 760s. That's kind of where we're putting the date on when Israel was first conquered by the Syrian Empire. And then much later, you had the conquest around 586 of the empire or the kingdom of Judah, and that was by the Babylonians. But then you also have prophetic books that were also written during the periods of the exile, which is around the 400. So this includes some portions of late Isaiah. So Isaiah, there are portions that reflect a post-exilic or a period in which they are already in Babylon. So we know that also that the prophets ministered during the history of the Jewish people, and we have a lot of those stories in the book of Second Kings and also through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But the prophetic books are also have they're divided into two categories, or actually three. We've already discussed already the former prophets. So those were the prophets that we see in the historical books. That know that and also the Pentateuch as well, because we do see Moses emerging as a prophet, Abraham as a prophet. We see Deborah in the Judges emerges as a prophet, but then we also see Samuel and Nathan. So those are the former prophets. But then now when we look in the prophetic books, there's two major categories. There are the major prophets. This includes Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations are often grouped together, Ezekiel, and Daniel. So these are our major prophets within the Protestant canon. And each of these books approximately takes up one scroll, especially the book of Isaiah. That would have been a very large scroll. But we also have what are called the minor prophets. And these are Hosea, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Overall, these books themselves, they take up about one papyri scroll. And so in general, they could be combined into one scroll. And often these books here, the minor prophets, they're also called the 12. So you will see that categorization within the Hebrew canon. They will just refer to these minor prophets as the 12. So that's how they are discussed. But when we look at the theology of the prophets, they have what scholars describe as a royal theology. We also can notice that during this time period in which the prophets ministered, they were primarily delivering their oracles or prophetic words to the king. And so they generally spoke to the king, they spoke to the rulers, the priests. They basically spoke to those or delivered their messages from the Lord to those who had power. So the oracles of the prophets were directed toward the ruling elite. But these prophets as well, they also held fast to God's promise for King David and his descendants. So even though we may see the prophetic books and how they're written also to the kingdom of Israel or to the kingdom of Judah, they also are embedded within them this belief that God is going to be faithful to his promises and that God will once again, through the lineage of King David, bring about a new king who will rule over the people of Judah, over the people of Israel. But also, when they gave their message, they also affirmed or at least recognized that God was also someone who would not dwell in a morally corrupt community, and that God will also hold the people accountable for their sins. But overall, this emphasis on this royal theology, this assumption or this belief in God's ability to bring about a new king through the lineage of King David, that is what is known as a royal theology. They assumed that God was going to restore the kingdom of Israel, going to restore the kingdom of Judah, and once again bring about a new king who's going to rule with justice over God's people. So there was this hope. There was this hope for the return of the Son of David to the throne of Jerusalem. This was a hope that we could see not just in the book of Isaiah, but we could also see this in other prophetic books. But first of all, Isaiah is a big book that kind of discusses this theme. We see in Isaiah 55, it says, "Give ear and come to me, listen that you may live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, my faithful love promised to David." Um, you can notice here in Isaiah that that hope that, or actually that promise that Samuel the prophet first announced is not lost here from the prophetic books. We could also see it in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel 34, you have this one story, or at least this description of the Good Shepherd, which in many ways echoes Jesus's teachings about the Good Shepherd in the Gospel of John. But here in Ezekiel 34, the prophet makes mention, says, "I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them, and he will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be a prince among them." Much later in verses 28 says, "They will no longer be plundered by the nations, nor will wild animals devour them. They will live in safety, and no one will make them afraid. I will provide for them a land renowned for its crops, and they will no longer be victims of famine in the land or bear the scorn of nations. Then they will know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and that they, the Israelites, are my people, declares the sovereign Lord." So you get this imagery of a shepherd, and this new shepherd that's going to emerge and rule over God's people. And this imagery is tied also to King David, who was the shepherd over Judah. So not only do we see this royal theology that also emerges, but we also have a creation theology. The prophetic books do talk a lot about creation, or at least the universe, and they always affirm that God is the creator and the ruler over the entire universe. And so when the prophets discuss creation, it's not merely like creation is not merely discussed just as some stage in the background, but they do recognize that God is the creator of everything, of the heavens and the earth. And they also give expression to God's deep and abiding care for creation. Creation, in other words, is not just a stage, but it's also part of the divine drama. There is this hope, this anticipation for this new world, for this new heaven and earth, this new way of living in which both the animals, along with people, will experience peace and harmony on the earth. So there is a lot of creation imagery in the prophetic books. Here's a couple of passages that discuss God as a creator of the entire universe. Isaiah 40:26. "Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. Or Isaiah 42:5. This is what God, the Lord, says, the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out and spreads out the earth with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. Or in Isaiah 44, it says, I am the Lord, the maker of all things, who stretches out the heavens, who spreads out the earth by myself. Or in Isaiah 45:7, I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. Here's another one in Jeremiah 10, verses 12 through 13. But God made the earth by his power, he founded the world by his wisdom, and he stretched out the heavens by his understanding. When he thunders, the water in the heavens roar. He makes clouds rise from the ends of the earth. He sends lightning with the rain and brings out the wind from his storehouse. Or in Jeremiah 27:5, with my great power and outstretched arm, I made the earth and its people and the animals that are in it, and I give it to anyone I please. So there is a lot of creation theology within the prophetic books. We also see this in the poetic literature as well. When you're reading Psalms, when you're reading Proverbs, there is a lot of creation theology there too. But in the prophetic books, you do get this emphasis that God is the creator and the maker of the entire universe, the heavens and the earth, the animals, all people, all of humanity. So it's creation theology is not just in the first two chapters of Genesis, but is actually throughout the entire Old Testament and even into the New Testament. But also, as I was mentioning earlier, there is a prophetic vision for a just world. And so it is true when we look at the prophetic books, there are a lot of these judgment oracles. And it is true that God does level some intense oracles against the nations, like in the early chapters of Isaiah. So there are some oracles of judgment throughout the prophetic books, also included judgment oracles against Israel and also Judah. But God is not just a God who's a judge or someone who's going to destroy the wicked. But what we also see in the prophetic literature is God is also working as a redeemer. So yes, judgment and redemption, they actually go hand in hand. Because for the prophets, God's work of judgment is part of God's work of redemption. So this judgment language, these oracles of judgment, also include within them promises and hope for a restoration. So in other words, it's not just about condemnation, but sometimes God needs to call out the sin before he could really address salvation, why they must be saved, and how salvation is possible. The prophets were also deeply intertwined with God's desire for redemption. And overall, what we can notice is that when they call out the people's sin, um, they were also recognizing that the people of God, they were failing in maintaining their covenant relationship with God, and also as a result, failing to maintain their proper relationship with their neighbors, with each other. And so overall, when we're reading the prophetic books, we will see a lot of judgment language. But God's judgment of evil, again, it is part of God's salvation from evil. These are the necessary steps. You cannot be saved unless you first address the sin. that is disrupting your relationship with God and with humanity, with one another, including the relationship with creation. And so this is what the prophets do. They proclaim this judgment against the nations, or they proclaim this judgment against the people of God. But what they have to do this because they have to expose the evil, the wickedness, the corruption that is amongst the people. Because unless it is exposed, they cannot be properly redeemed. Their love for God cannot be restored and renewed unless their sin is called out and held to account. So in many ways, this exposure of evil, it does also pave the way for a restored relationship. Or another way of thinking about this is God judges so that he might save. And so we don't see one without the other. Yes, we see a God who's engaged in salvation and redemption, but before you get that salvific God, you have the other God that is holding people accountable for their sin, their evil, and their corruption. So you will see a lot of prophetic denunciations, these judgment oracles. And sometimes when we read the prophetic books, we may think that that's all they're doing. They're just, holding the people accountable. But it's not, we cannot have one without the other. And there's also no way of really highlighting the really great positive aspects about redemption and restoration and the promised Messiah until you go through the reality of sin and evil that is amongst the people of God. You just have to. There's no way to separate that in the prophetic books. So this leads me to another aspect when it comes to the ethics of the prophets. And this is what we could see. Two main failures that you see in the prophetic literature. It was a failure to love God, and it was also a failure to love one's neighbor as oneself. Um, So these are the two main issues, a failure to love God and a failure to love one's neighbor as oneself. But the failure to love God was basically like the root of all other failures. And the prophetic literature, it critiques this by pointing out the idolatry amongst the people of God. And this failure to love God does take many forms, but the most primarily way in which we see it in the prophetic books is whenever the people of God are worshiping false gods or they're worshiping idols. So this is why you will also read within the prophetic literature, they're critiquing the people, the Israelites or the people of Judah, for worshiping Baal or worshiping Asherah and the idols of their neighbors. So you will see this critique against worshiping these pagan gods. So the prophets do rail against this and holding the people accountable for their idolatry. So idolatry within the prophetic books is like the root sin. It's, it's a root sin that disrupts not only their love for God, but also starts to disrupt their love for their neighbor. So the worship of idols also led to the failure to trust God, the failure to love God, and also the failure to worship God properly. So they started trusting in the gods of their neighbors. They started trusting in idols for their deliverance. They started trusting in all these other gods for their sustenance and their political independence and security. So here are a couple of passages that discuss, or at least you can have some examples of when the prophets are talking about the idolatry in the by the people of God. Here's Hosea 4:12. He says, "My people, they consult a wooden idol, and the diviner's rod speaks to them. A spirit of prostitution leads them astray. They are unfaithful to their God." Or in Hosea 11:12, but the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals and they burned incense to images. Or in Jeremiah 2:8, the priest did not ask, where is the Lord? Those who deal with the law did not know me. The leaders rebelled against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal, following worthless idols. So notice here, not only do you see it in the book of Hosea, but also in Jeremiah, where idolatry is running rampant in Israel and also in Judah. But this idolatry is not just practiced by the people, but it's an idolatry that's also practiced by the religious leaders or the ruling elites. It's those who were entrusted with the very words of God, who are entrusted to lead God's people. The prophets are calling them out. And so the prophets recognize that this failure to love God properly leads to the failure to love one's neighbor. And so idolatry not only corrupts one's relationship with God, it also corrupts our relationship with our brothers and sisters. Um, and this is called out in terms of the injustice and the unrighteousness that is amongst the people of Israel and Judah. Um, so you will see a lot of critiques of wickedness in the land. Um, and at the same time, those who follow the Lord are those who practice and live a life of justice and righteousness. And so there is a lot uh, of moral or immoral acts and attitudes and actions that the prophets discuss. These are not just personal, individualistic, or spiritual sins that do not affect our relationship with others. When the prophets are talking about murder and corruption and evil, they're talking about the society in which Judah and Israel have constructed. So these are also social sins that the prophets are railing against. And there's all sorts of violence and evil that the prophets are identifying. But overall, it does come under this broader umbrella of injustice and unrighteousness, or this wickedness in the land. And as I mentioned briefly, it's mainly addressing those in power. So the voice or the oracles of the prophets are also critiquing those who have the ability to do what is just and do what is right. So it's a complaint about those in power, mostly kings and government officials, those who are gobbling up the land and also threatening the vulnerable. The prophets are those who see injustice in the marketplace, especially when the poor are being cheated. They also are railing against the injustice in the courtroom, including judges who are taking bribes. And so the prophets, they rail against the religious leaders, political leaders, the kings. They're railing against those people who ought to be leading and teaching the people of God. So you will see this within the prophetic literature. And so here you have a couple of passages, very famous, popular passages. Some of my favorite ones are in Amos 5:24. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Or in Hosea 4, 1 through 12, 1 through 2, hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There's no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. Only cursing, lying, murdering, stealing, adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. So notice, it's not just like spiritual sins, but it's violence, it's theft, it's the murdering of their neighbors, it's violence against another person's humanity. Or in Isaiah 5:7, and he looked for justice, but he saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but he heard cries of distress. Or in Amos 5:10 through 11, they hate the one who upholds justice in court and detest the one who tells the truth. You trample on the poor and you force him to give you a tribute of grain. Therefore, though you have built beautiful stone houses, you will not live in them. Though you have planted lush vineyards, you will not drink their wine. So notice here in this passage in Amos, so you can see it's a critique against the injustice in the courts. Um, and there's a lot of people who are also lying and engaging in deception, or to even tell the truth is frowned upon in this context. And there's also an oppression against the poor and the marginalized. And there's this economic critique against the rich, those who have these wealthy homes and these lush vineyards. So notice the language of the prophets. Or here's another one in Micah 3:11. Her leaders judge for a bribe. Her priests teach for a price, and her prophets tell fortunes for money. So notice here, it's the prophets, it's the priests, and it's the governmental officials, those judges, those who ought to be upholding righteousness and truth. This is the message that the prophet Micah is railing against. It says, yet they look for the Lord's support and they say, is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us. But God also emerges in the minor prophets as one who will judge the arrogant and those who do not offer help to their neighbors. One particular book, Obadiah, often it's a minor prophet. We don't really give this book a lot of attention. But here's a critique against Edom for failing to help the people of God. So this is the Lord says to Edom, I will cut you down to a size among the nations, and you will be greatly despised. You have been deceived by your own pride because you live in a rock fortress and you make your home high in the mountains. Who can ever reach us up here? You ask boastfully. But even if you soar as high as eagles and build your nest among the stars, I will bring you crashing down, says the Lord. Here you can see this critique against Edom is a part of a larger critique of failing to help their neighbors, help the people of God. But here you have this sense of Edom, they were trusting in their own wealth and in their own security, but yet God still has a word for them. So overall, part of failing to love one's neighbor is this development of arrogance and also pride in one's ability and security. So you can see that the prophets are calling out not just spiritual, personal, individual sins, but the prophets are also calling out the social sins that they see amongst the people of Israel, the people of Judah. And God also despises those who engage in human trafficking. Believe it or not, human trafficking is mentioned in the prophetic books. Notice this passage here in Joel 3, verses 2 through 7. It says, there I will judge them for harming my people, my special possession, for scattering my people among the nations and for dividing up my land. They threw dice and they decided which of my people would be their slaves. They traded boys to obtain prostitutes and sold girls for enough wine to get drunk. What do you have against me, Tyre and Sidon, and you cities of Philistia? Are you trying to take revenge on me? If you are, then watch out. I will strike swiftly and pay you back for everything you have done. You have taken my silver, my gold, and all my precious treasures, and you have carried them off to your pagan temples. You have sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks. so that they could take them far from their homeland. But I will bring them back from all the places to which you sold them, and I will pay you back for everything you have done. Notice here this in practice of slavery, this practice of human trafficking, this smuggling, deportation, and the movement of human body. Uh, God has an oracle against those who engage in the trafficking of children. This is a brutal violation of their inherent dignity and worth. And in fact, for the prophet Joel, human trafficking embodies this very lack of faithfulness and love for one's neighbor. So overall, when we're looking at the prophetic vision for a just world, we'll notice that there is a special care and concern for the most vulnerable of society: the widows, the orphans, the refugees, the migrants, the poor and oppressed. Isaiah exhorts the people saying the following. This is in Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Or in Isaiah 10:1 through 2, woe to those who decree unjust laws and to those who constantly write oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of justice and to rob the rights of the needy, to make their widows their prey and plunder the fatherless. What will you do on the day of reckoning when disaster comes from afar? To whom will you run for help? Where will you leave your wealth? Read these passages. Notice these passages here. Who's this critiquing towards? It's towards those who have power, those who have wealth, those who are oppressing the people of God, taking advantage of marginalized communities and people, the fatherless, the widow, the poor, those who don't have access to power. There is a special concern for the most vulnerable within the prophetic writings. And so this is why the prophets, they champion the causes of the needy and they confront those in power, the arrogant, and those who exploit other people for money, especially even including in the engagement of slave labor and human trafficking. But the prophets also had a vision for God's preferred future. They saw the end eventually one day, that there will be an end of war and violence. And here you also have Isaiah 2:4, where it's making mention the following: that God will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many people. They will beat their swords into the plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Or in Isaiah 11:6 through 9, which is part of the messianic prophecy that actually begins in Isaiah 11, verses 1 through 2. This is a part of this messianic kingdom that will be ushered in by the root of Jesse. It says the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, the young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. Notice the creation imagery here. It is in many ways drawing us back to Genesis in the Garden of Eden, but it's also pointing us forward to a period in which the peace and harmony will not just be amongst nations or between humanity and God, but also will extend into the animal kingdom. So there's this future hope that peace will impact the entire created order. And also, too, this imagery of the wolf and the lamb, and all these animals that are there that are mentioned, um, in prophetic literature, there's a lot of animal imagery. And in many ways, too, sometimes animals are metaphorical representations of nations. Um, and so when we're reading these texts, there's one way of reading it in terms of the restored order of creation, but also metaphorically, this is also the restored order and peace amongst different nations living together once more in God's paradise. And then it makes mention they will neither harm nor destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the water covered the sea. And so this leads me to a couple of questions for our final discussion. As we kind of conclude and think about this prophetic message and just overall the theology of the prophets, there's a couple of questions that I have for us to reflect upon. It says the prophets called for justice and righteousness. What are some examples of injustice in our society today that the prophets will likely speak out against? Number two, the prophets had a concern for the vulnerable. What are some of the vulnerable people in your community? And how can we show them God's love and advocate for their well being? Number three, the prophets teach us that God's judgment is part of his redemption. How can we view these difficult situations not just as negative experiences, but as opportunities for positive change, growth, or even a chance for God's redemptive work to occur? This is primarily reflecting upon the judgment language in the prophetic books.